sesshin that is in December 2019 here at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico. And the significance of Rohatsu is that it is a memorial sesshin in a sense. It is an example and it mimics the awakening experience of the Buddha. Not just the awakening experience, but the process, part of the process that went towards it. When he had left the palace and gone out into the forest, into the jungles, and connected with a couple of different spiritual teachers, and delved into the spiritual practice of the day, which was largely ascetic practices. And he'd done that for 6 years and gotten quite good at it, of course, and realized that as he was mortifying his body, if he went past a certain point, he would die without having answered his questions. Because he went out into the jungle because he wanted to know what was beyond ordinary experience, ordinary life. We're born, we grow, we live in a particular family, we have certain experiences, and then we die. Is that all? There's something beyond. And this sense that there's something beyond what we ordinarily perceive is how a number of people come to practice. And it's true, there is something beyond. We have our normal way of experiencing life, but most likely it's not as totally present as we are capable of being. And when we are actually being so totally present that any ideas about who we are disappears, it's very different. Many years ago, while I was living at Sogenji in Japan, I met a man who had a rather unique story. His name was Mario Montesa. He was Swiss-Italian, or Italian-Swiss, I never know which it is. He was living in Switzerland, born and raised in Switzerland, but on the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland. And he had realized when he was quite young, I think around 14, that he had some level of capacity for healing. He also was a tremendous music lover and played music. And so when an American band that had recently lost its bass guitarist on a world tour arrived in his city, they were looking for a new bass guitarist to replace the one that had died. And he was auditioned and got the job. He was told that if he could leave by 6 o'clock the next morning with the band, he had the job. And so he did. And he played with the band for many years. They eventually got married, had a son, and one point in time, they were in London and they were doing a publicity party in a house, I guess it was, in London. He came out of the party at 5 o'clock in the morning to go home and woke up 6 weeks later in the hospital, completely paralyzed, totally blind, and mute. All he could do was hear. And it's very interesting because it is said in Buddhism that the last sense to disappear when we die is our hearing. At any rate, somehow they recognized that he was alive and not brain dead, and he set to work trying to heal. Focused on one of the big toes in one of his feet, and after 3 months managed to get it to move. 7 months and he was able to see light and dark, but not see clearly. In a year, he was finally able to have his full vision back. And when I met him, it was 16 years, I think, after the accident had happened. Somebody actually had stabbed him in the heart. That's what he learned later. And he was clinically dead between 6 and 8 minutes, according to the medical authorities. When I knew him, he was walking, talking. He came to Sogenji. He was a friend of the Roshis who had met him in Switzerland. And by that time, he was well involved with a beautiful woman who he's still with many years later. And he was a very unique human being. Most people, when you close your eyes, if you're in front of a person, there's still a sense of energy about that person. Try it sometime. But with Mario, there was no one there. He told his story to all of us at Sogenji at the Roshi's request, although he also said that he doesn't normally tell that story because it is of no importance to him. He has no feelings one way or another about the person that stabbed him. There's no residue on it for him. And he has worked since then into a deeply spiritual life. His wife left him. Their son was a year old at the time when the accident happened. And of course, he was no longer playing in the band. But one of the things he said was something we might all take note of. Not in order to replicate it, of course, but to recognize that thought, speech has a place, but it's not the be-all and end-all of life. For Mario, he couldn't think for many, many months. That capacity had not rewired itself into his brain yet. By the time I met him, of course, he could think all he wanted to. And what he said was, when he began to be able to think again, it was an enormous disappointment. Why was it an enormous disappointment? He didn't say, but it's easy to know. Because suddenly there were words between him and reality. Whether they were silent words or there were heard words, spoken words, it didn't matter. There was a veil suddenly between him and reality. It's something we should consider, because thought is a tool, words are a tool, and they can be extremely helpful and very important. We're taught to emphasize that, however, in our Western way of life, unless we're an American Indian. And the Native Americans have a different way often of raising their children. One of the things that they are known to do, and it's not necessarily every tribe, but it's universal enough that it's written about. At the age when a child starts asking all kinds of why questions. Why is the sky blue? Why do I have to go to bed? Why this? Why that? And you can say because, and they'll say, but why? And it's a phase children go through. It's actually something that most parents don't want to encourage. For one thing, it challenges their self-esteem as the one who knows everything more than their child does. But also, it's kind of a bother sometimes when you've got a 3-year-old that's saying, why? Well, this is why. But why? Well, because. But why? Well, the Native Americans, apparently, when the children get to that point, they say, go out into the woods and be really quiet. And when you are really quiet, the trees and the bushes and the breeze will tell you why. And so they naturally develop, many of them, a deep inner silence, an ability to be without words and without thought, just present. Some years back, here in the valley, this traditional Spanish village here, up in the mountains of northern New Mexico, Posadas, Las Posadas, is celebrated at Christmas time. That is the reenactment of Mary and Joseph's search for a room at the inn. It's sung in Spanish, and it's the one event that happens in our tiny little church in this valley now that they have so few Catholic priests these days, from Spain at least, because we are still in a Spanish area where the Catholic Church, Spanish Catholic Church, sends priests, missionary priests to mission to take care of the people here in this area. And it usually draws a number of people who aren't in the valley. And one year there was a Native American man, probably around in his 40s or 50s, and he brought his mother with him too. And the deep quiet of both of these people was palpable. It is important to dare to be as present as possible without analyzing it, without thinking about it, without distracting yourself by thinking about other things. And yet, we human beings have a hard time doing that. Recently, I was driving down to Albuquerque, and I had just heard news that I needed to relay to somebody else. And as I'm driving down the hill into Chimayo, I realized that that very person I needed to talk to was driving right behind me. So I honked the horn a lot and pulled over to the side in hopes that that person would stop and I could relay the message. And that person whizzed by. So later, when I was able to see that person again, I said, did you realize that was me on the highway? And I was wondering why you didn't stop, because I had something to share with you. I was going to be gone all day that day, and that seemed to be an optimal opportunity to share this news, which was kind of important news and impacted the person that was behind me. And what was said was, well, you had said that you were going to be leaving at 8:30 and it was already 9:30, so I assumed you were already gone. And that brought something up that's important for all of us to consider, because it inhibits our practice. Assumptions. When we have an assumption about something, whether it's an assumption about what we are going to experience at the end of the out-breath in our Sesshin practice, or anything else, it kind of elbows other possibilities out of the way. And if we think we already know, then there's no room for the moment to be expressed, to be experienced. If we've already got some other reality applied on top of it. The Buddha even said that we are inhibited in our spiritual practice by our conditioning. We're born not exactly a fresh slate, if you believe in rebirth, but if you don't have to believe in that. It's not an essential to be practicing this practice. But at any rate, anyone who's seen the birth of a child it's pretty clear that that child already comes in with a personality. Where did that personality come from? It's not known that cells are imbued with personality. And this little being started with the mating of two cells. Right? One cell that was expanded and multiplied into multiple cells and differentiated into a little body. And that body grows, becomes an adult if the karma is there for it. But where does the person come from? As we grow, instantaneously we begin to be conditioned. Our environment, the people around us, how they interact with us or don't interact with us, is noted and responded to or reacted to right from the very beginning. Children learn to smile. Babies learn to smile when the caregiver smiles at the baby and interacts with the baby. There's something known as entrainment that takes place in the raising of an infant. The infant learns how to react or respond, either one, to circumstances based on how their primary caregiver does. And if the primary caregiver has been absent or not present in caregiving ways, that is a recipe for creating a psychopath or a sociopath. Because human beings depend on other human beings to know how to be human. But as we grow, some of these experiences are positive and some of these experiences may be negative. And the ones that are negative, we take on as a reality about ourselves, the ones that are positive as well. And we gradually develop a self-image, an idea, a picture of who we are. And in certain superficial ways, that helps us navigate society. And one of the great fears that can come up for people at a particular point in practice is if they go past a point in that practice, if they go deeper in their practice, are they going to turn into an idiot? Not know how to behave in society? Do stupid things? Well, the answer is no, really, we won't. But there is a great fear of that. And so we wrap this identity around us as if we know from being who we think we are how to behave. The problem is that brings us a great deal of pain and suffering, and it also distances us from the joy and the radical experience of total presence in our life. And Zen practice is about opening to who we truly are, seeing beyond the self-image and seeing it for what it is, which basically is not who we are. It's just an accumulation of experiences that we've drawn conclusions about and made a picture of. And we're captive to it until we are able to see through it sufficiently. At the same time, as I said, seeing through it can feel dangerous. It can feel frightening. But when we reach that point in our practice where fear comes up, the most important thing to do is to open our arms and embrace the experience of fear. The energy in our body, what is it doing? Does it feel like icy fingers wrapping themselves around our body, what does it really feel like, this fear? Feeling fear can't hurt us. Excuse me. But we try to avoid feeling it by all sorts of ways. We distance ourselves from our body in many, many different ways on many different occasions because of feelings that we don't want to feel, because they're uncomfortable. And yet, to be who we really are, we need to walk right in and let ourselves experience the energy of those feelings. We have to stay out of the story, because stories are stories. They don't solve things. But if we go into our body and feel the energy of, for example, anger or fear, it's amazing the freedom that can result. True freedom that allows us to be really present and experience the joy of the moment, no matter what that moment brings. This is the gift of our practice. Because we're working on letting go our conditioning, we're letting go of our assumptions, we're letting go of this seemingly protective self-image, which really is nothing but a play of light, an idea. It has no basis in reality. But as we let it go, we can live fully, and that makes an enormous amount of difference in our life and in what we are able to offer to everyone and everything else. This self-image really holds us hostage. We feel compelled to protect it, reinforce it, defend it. We get upset if it gets insulted. We're uncomfortable if we get embarrassed. And if we get embarrassed, it's because something has questioned the self-image. These are actually good cues. And if, for example, you are willing to just open to what that embarrassment feels like, for example, it can bring you the same kind of freedom that opening to fear or anger or any other energy in your body can do. And the amazing thing is that when you can do that, particularly in a difficult situation, you connect with an underlying river of joy that seems to run through life. And I'll give you a rather odd example of this that happened to me when I was 26 years old. We had just come back from living 2 years in Chiang Mai, Thailand. My husband was a diplomat. We were with the consulate in Chiang Mai. Prior to that, we were back in the United States for 10 months while we were learning Thai language. Prior to that, we were in Burma, first in Yangon, as the natives speak of it. Rangoon is how the British pronounced it. And then for 2 years in Mandalay, so a total of almost 3 years in Burma. So pretty much 5 years in Southeast Asia. And when I had been in Burma, I had gotten amoebic dysentery. And badly enough that it had some after effects. So by the time we came back from Thailand, those after effects were pretty rampant. And we were assigned, for curious reasons, to the University of Michigan, where my husband was to get more training in Southeast Asian studies because he was already considered a Southeast Asian specialist with the State Department. And so I spent a fair amount of time in the GI floor of this enormous teaching hospital that was part of the University of Michigan Medical School. And one of the fundamental tests they give you if you've got gut problems, at least lower gut problems, is barium enema, which is not a pleasant experience. And I had one, and then later I had to have another one. And if you've ever had a barium enema, you know that at a certain point your body is desperate to expel that radioactive white stuff that they pump into you. And for some unknown reason, they already scheduled 6 people in a block of time to get these tests, and they only had 2 bathrooms. And once you end up in that bathroom, you're going to stay there for probably an hour as your body tries to rid itself of this poison. So the first time I was fortunate enough to have access to an empty bathroom. So I knew what it could be like. The second time, however, both bathrooms were occupied and continued to be occupied. And as my body ramped up in its urgency to expel this toxin, I finally realized that I had to find a bathroom or it was going to be all over, literally, in that little waiting room. And so I went on into this vast hallway, which stretched from one end to the other of this probably 100-foot long building. It was quite wide, probably between 30 and 50 feet wide, full of people, and asked the first person in a white coat where there was a bathroom. And this poor young man decided he had to ask me why I needed a bathroom. If a person asked for a bathroom, I would think that it would be pretty obvious that they need a bathroom. They're not just asking about the landscape. And that was just enough of a delay that in wonderful Zen form, I demonstrated exactly why I needed a bathroom, right there out in the middle of that wide hallway full of people. The poor guy was mortified and immediately found me a bathroom. But by that time, I had ruined my shoes. I was only wearing a hospital gown, so there wasn't much else to ruin. But what happened was a phenomenal experience, because perhaps I was just so present in that moment that what registered was the poor man's embarrassment, anguish really, and not anything of embarrassment for me. I was not embarrassed at all. There was just this amazing, immense freedom. Beyond anything anybody could imagine. There I am, in the middle of this crowded hallway, doing something in public nobody would ever want to do in public. And definitely, it was pretty obvious what was happening. There's no way to hide it. And yet, there was such freedom. I will never forget that experience. I wasn't doing Zen practice at the time, but it came handy, the memory of it, the memory of what could be reached when one allowed oneself to be fully present. I mean, I had a couple of choices. I could have been fully present, or I could have hid my head in shame. But it's kind of hard to hide your head in shame in the middle of a public hallway full of people. It never occurred to me to even consider that. And yet that's what most people do all the time. Our conditioning has a role, because, you know, if you really don't have any conditioning, you don't know how to navigate society. And there are people, for example, if you have a stroke in a certain part of your brain, you don't You're not able to respond to ordinary cues in the normal way, and you may end up, for example, at a funeral, bursting into laughter, or suddenly sobbing in the middle of something that's really a happy experience, and you have no control over it. It's a defect that comes to light when you've had a stroke in that particular part of the brain. But that's not what happens to us when we have an awakening experience. If it's a deep enough awakening experience, there's a profound understanding, a resonance with the moment as it is, clearly as it is, not as we assume it is, but clearly as it is, that allows us to respond accurately, appropriately to the moment, and not out of some conditioning, not out of some assumptions about it. So as we go about our practice, it's really important to question those assumptions, because what they do is, well, create almost like a straitjacket around us and prevent us from truly experiencing the moment as it is, which, when we can, is tremendously freeing. Our practice, as we go deeper and embrace the fear that naturally comes up, we begin to move in the direction of being able to do that. The great Zen master Hakuin, who single-handedly resurrected a moribund Rinzai Zen practice in Japan several hundred years ago, and so deeply and effectively so that all the lineages now, all the Rinzai lineages now in Japan trace back through Hakuin. The others have died out. And so it's traditional every year at the Rohatsu Sesshin to share Hakuin's Rohatsu exhortations. He had little talks each night, and I'll share these with you during this sesshin. Some of them are quite relevant to us. Others are somewhat less so, but a nice, interesting window on Hakuin's teaching. So this is his instructions to the monks for Rohatsu Sesshin the first night. The master said, to practice jhana, which of course is meditation, you should sit yourself on a thick cushion, loosen your robe and belt, and assume the full lotus posture. After straightening up your spine and settling into a comfortable position, you should begin counting your breaths. The breathing exercise is foremost among all the countless samadhis. When the cinnabar field, that is the tanden or the hara, below the navel fills to repletion with vital energy, start working on your koan. Cut life off at its roots. If you continue practicing like this over the months and years and are not remiss, your kensho is assured, as certain as reaching down and touching the earth at your feet. Strive hard, strive hard. Now this bears a little explanation, I think. To practice meditation, or zazen, you should sit yourself on a thick cushion, loosen your robe and belt, and assume the full lotus posture. Now we're talking Japan here. In the West, most of us don't sit in the full lotus posture, although I remember Mitra-roshi always did, but he didn't start out that way. In fact, his first sesshin he ever went to, he fainted from the pain of trying to pull himself into some kind of cross-legged position at Hoshinji. There are many ways to sit, including lying down. And one thing to recall is the story of Yaeko Iwasaki, a young Japanese woman who had TB, as it was rampant in those days in Japan, being a very cold and damp place, particularly in the wintertime. Yaeko had started doing zazen after her father had a kensho. He had turned 60 years old, and great fear had come up in him at that point, and so he started doing practice, and after a year he had a kensho experience, and then inspired Yaeko to start practicing herself. She became more and more ill and eventually died of TB. And the last 3 weeks of her life, she had every single day another deeper kensho experience. This is a young woman who was full of fever, coughing up blood, no energy, most likely lying in bed, doing deep practice. That's something to remember. We don't necessarily have to be in the full lotus position. If our legs are accommodating, that's fine. Go for it. It's a balanced posture. There are advantages to it, but not to the point where you put yourself into agony to get there, because that's going to interfere with your practice. Sit in a way that will allow you to be fully present and engrossed in your practice. And the foremost practice here, just as Hakuin emphasizes, is the extended out-breath, the Susokkan practice, which is really a jet assist in our practice. It cuts through attachments as swiftly as Manjusri's sword. To give yourself fully to that extended out-breath. And the koan he's speaking of, and no doubt he had some people, some of his students were on koans. He did not like the mu koan. He felt that the sound of one hand was a more effective koan for his students. But whether or not you're on one of the quote official close quote koans or not, something brought you to practice. A yearning, a need to reach beyond. Big questions about why there is suffering. Take that energy and harness it and use that to reach through the out-breath without any assumptions, opening to possibility. You have no idea what that possibility will bring, but open to possibility that something might become clear to you if you do this long enough, and it will. It will. Hakuin also emphasizes the tanden or the hara, and that's also very, very vital. It was taught in Rochester too, it was emphasized in Rochester, but I didn't pay enough attention to it initially. And because I was pretty tied in knots when I started practice anyway, I just stayed more tied in knots. And I remember going into Doksan at one point telling the Roshi that I felt like I had steel bands around my head and that they were tightening every second. The tension was all up in my shoulders, my neck, and my head. It wasn't until I made a concerted effort to allow my energy and my awareness and my presence to be down in my hara that my practice really started taking off. So it's important to pay attention to that. As we sit down, tune in. What does that feel like down here? Allow yourself to have your mind seated in that location, because your mind can be seated anywhere. It's not caught up here. In fact, there's a big question about whether it's there to begin with at all. Allow yourself to be open to possibility. Dive deep through the out-breath and persist. Persist. Great stubbornness is how I name one of the 3 pillars of Zen. It's great faith, great doubt, and great determination. Well, great stubbornness works too. Harness it. Use it. We have 7 more days, basically. I mean, we have 7 nights, and we go all the way through the last night into the 8th morning, just as the Buddha did. Give everything to this. The whole universe supports you in it. I thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.